All right. Tash Dile, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our speakers and to our lovely live audience tuning in from across the globe. Welcome to the virtual event of Freedom Hour, an online event hosted by the Asia Freedom Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that calls for democracy and religious freedom in Tibet and China. I'm Sakina Butt, and I'm the moderator for Asia Freedom Institute's Freedom Hour. So today we will be talking about cultural genocide under Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. And joining us for this discussion, we have Mr. Engebarte Tokochok, Director of Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center. We have Zumrite Arkin, who's the Program and Advocacy Manager at the World Uyghur Congress. She is also the chair of the Women's Committee of the World Uyghur Congress. We have Tenzin Chukila, Senior Researcher at Tibet Watch, and Professor Divyesh Anand, professor at the University of Westminster, UK. A very warm welcome to AFI's discussion, our dear panelists, and we look forward to having a very productive and an informative one. And before I start, let me quickly run you through the agenda for today's event. So firstly, we will be starting off with two general questions for each speakers, and each speakers will be having 3 minutes each to give your answers, followed by individual questions. And we have two rounds of individual questions, and for that, our speakers will have 5 minutes each. So without further ado, let me start off with the first general question, and we will start with Mr. Engebate Tokochok. So, Mr. Togochok, can you describe how the policies of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party have directly impacted the identity and cultural heritage, language, and religious practices of the Mongolians, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, and other ethnic and non-Chinese communities in China? How do Beijing's efforts to sinicize and assimilate these communities amount to cultural genocide? Over to you, Mr. Engebatu.
Sure. The Chinese regime is, you can call it a genocide machine. It's committing multiple genocide with multiple forms on multiple fronts. For example, the well-known genocide is committed in East Turkestan, or known as Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, against the Uyghur people and other ethnic minorities in the region. So, other than that, government of China is actually committing which we call a cultural genocide in southern Mongolia and Tibet. So they are trying to wipe out the entire culture, tradition, and identity of the Mongolian and Tibetan people entirely. So the goal is very clear for despite the different forms of these genocide, their goal is the same. So the goal is to wipe out all people, all these three nations, Mongolians, Tibetans, Uyghurs. The only difference is the government of China is using a different form of genocide. So behind this, the new round of genocide, in fact, the government of China has been committing this genocide since the day one in 1949. But the recent one is a renewed new round of genocide. Behind this new round of genocide is the so-called the second generation ethnic policy, the proposed by, I think it's three Chinese official scholars named Ma Rong, Hu Lianghe, and Hu Angang. These three officials proposed to the central government of China that um, the in People's Republic of China, now it is time for all 55 so-called ethnic minorities uphold the single national identity, which is Zhonghua means or Chinese nationality, common identity. So the now is in China, entire China, as the new campaign of firm inculcation of Chinese nationality, common identity, is sweeping across the entire nation, especially in Southern Mongolia, East Turkestan, and Tibet. The idea is that now is a time for these three peoples and nations to completely just uphold, embrace the Chinese culture, Chinese tradition, instead of emphasizing their own national identity. So this is in fact, this is nothing but a genocide, a cultural genocide that's aiming at the complete eradication of our culture, language, tradition, and identity.
Thank you, Mr. Engebata Tokochok, and thank you so much for bringing out the topic on generation ethnic policy, which actually needs a lot of focus on. Okay, moving on to Zumbrite Arkin, let's hear your perspective on this.
Thank you so much for these really great insights as well. I would like to first start this by commemorating this very dark day today. Today marks the 9th anniversary of the Yerkan massacre, which was one of the deadliest massacre in East Turkestan following very brutal crackdown on religious freedom in 2014 in the summer. Thousands of Uyghur people have died and in protesting against the government and have been disappeared as well. So today we're celebrating this very dark day. My colleagues are all out protesting in front of the Chinese consulate, but I'm glad to be joining all of you here today. I think for us, for Uyghurs in East Turkestan, this is beyond a cultural genocide at this point. This is a full-on genocide that was also recognized by the US government, by 11 different parliaments and senates around the world. As well as the Independent Uyghur Tribunal that confirmed this in their judgment in December 2021. So for us, of course, there's also the aspect of cultural genocide, which the Chinese government has, over the past few years implemented a series of legislations and laws that really came to restrict any sort of freedoms for the Uyghur and Turkic people in the region. And I think the aspect of sinicization plays a huge role in this process as well. Sinicization policies are present not only in East Turkestan, but also throughout Tibet and Inner Mongolia. And the ultimate aim is really to assimilate the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongolians, but also all sorts of other ethnic groups into one unique Chinese identity, which is the Han Chinese identity. The Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party is against anything that is a little different from, the CCP line, the CCP identity. So that is also why our different ethnic groups, our communities have been targeted, because everything about our identity is very different. Our culture, our religion, our traditions, our values are very different from, the Chinese ethnic or Chinese identity. For example, for Uyghurs, we're Turkic people, we speak Turkic language, we practice Islam. So for the government using these sinicization policies, for example, they've targeted the teaching of religious education, the passing down of that education to the second generations, to other generations, upcoming generations, by massively detaining Uyghurs and also criminalizing any aspects of religious freedom. So but also sinicization policies are present in the education system, where the bilingual education policies have also contributed to the eradication of or the elimination of Uyghur language as a medium of education. This is similar in Tibet as well, in Inner Mongolia, and the aim again here is ultimate assimilation for the upcoming generations of Uyghurs, of Tibetans, of Mongolians to completely identify themselves to the main Han Chinese identity. I believe you're muted, Sakina.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you so much, Zumbrite, and thank you for talking about the bilingual education. Yeah, China has been targeting the younger generation, and it is the younger generation that needs to be involved in our respective community causes. Okay, let's hear the perspective of Tezi Chukila.
Thank you. Thank you, Sakina, and everyone for having me. Regarding this question, there is historical continuity in the cultural genocide of what the Chinese Communist Party has officially categorized these peoples as ethnic minorities in their own countries. But ever since Xi Jinping took power and following the 19th National Party Congress, amendments in the constitution has enabled him to stay indefinitely in power and also enshrine Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era as a guiding thought or, so to speak, philosophy. But for Tibetans, he entered into the rule into the office at a time when they were silently mourning the loss of around 80 Tibetans who have burned themselves alive in protest against the Chinese government, calling for freedom, the return of their aging leader in exile, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, and an end to the repressive policies. So, what Xi Jinping has called a new era sits in contrast against the conscience of the Tibetan people who have seen, very sadly, a new generation of young Tibetans, mostly in their 20s, call for freedom, although they have not directly been there in the last middle of the last century when all these countries were brutally colonized. Um, but so there's all heralding of new era sits amid a litany of new legislations and regulations. And amid all of this, Xi Jinping has aggressively consolidated power, and the sinicization campaign did gain momentum after the 6th and 7th Tibet work forums, and so did the implementation of the monastic management committees, which has seen uh, CCP members permanently work in the monasteries and oversee the daily curriculum of a religious community. So, and last year, so in 2021, when the Chinese Communist Party observed their centenary anniversary in the great monasteries of Tibet and elsewhere, the monks were forced to organize a Tibetan calligraphy contest to commemorate CCP's founding. So that's the level of Tibetans. That's how they use a creative spirit of Tibetans. A calligraphy contest was observed initially and initiated by Tibetans themselves a few years ago on 30th of April, but they used it to commemorate their founding anniversary. And Xi Jinping, so during his era, he has also proudly announced an end to absolute poverty. But then we know that in the Tibetan farmers and nomadic households, poverty alleviation is something that is always, dictated as a benevolence, as benevolence of the state, as a gift from the state, and that they should always be loyal to the Chinese Communist Party. And throughout his time in office, protest against land confiscations, against the state-owned companies who are mining inside Tibet, infrastructure projects, as well as the replacement of Tibetan language from schools has continued. And then we now know that after the implementation of the second generation ethnic policy, at least in Ganzi, we know that several middle schools will no longer have their only Tibetan language class from next year onwards. And preschool children are taught in Putonghua, Mandarin Chinese. So, and as we all know, nearly 1 million Tibetan children are subjected to an education system that has no respect to and that is not rooted in Tibetan history, culture, and religion. And another factor that I think should never be overlooked when we think about Xi's era is WeChat. And smartphones. That is the defining experience of our modern life. WeChat came out 1 year before he came into office, And what was impossible before, for Tibetans in and outside, as are all the exiled communities, we were able to get in touch with our families and friends, relatives long lost, to hold and talk, send messages, photos, and videos. But then for the cyber administration of China, this basic human desire to connect and share has become a means to control, to exploit, and then to eliminate what has now, during his era, termed historical nihilism. So that is a cultural genocide that is ongoing, but at the pace which has been accelerated by the rapid change in technology, and especially communication technology.
Thank you so much, Chukila. And I totally agree with you that in the name of poverty alleviation, China has been doing a lot of activities that results to cultural genocide. And thank you for talking about the WeChat cyber security thing. And we had actually spoken about this in our previous session, the rise of China's digital authoritarianism too. Thank you so much, Shukila. And let's hear Professor Divyesh Anand's perspective.
Thank you again for having us here. So I'll not repeat anything which other colleagues have said because no point repeating and reinforcing it, right? But let's imagine those who are skeptical of the genocide claim. So, like, I'm sure all of us come across people who say, but it is not cultural genocide. It is not even genocide. Look, Tibetans are alive, most of them. Southern Mongolia, they might have some change, but they're still alive. Yes, Uyghurs are in camps, but it's not a death camp. It's a work camp. We get all of that. Now, to answer that question, I would say that what if you look at genocide? Genocide is eradication of a people, right? A people. Now, what makes, let's say, Tibetans a people are certain cultural values, similar with Uyghurs and Mongolians, right? There's culture. Now, if people interpret genocide narrowly to talk about only death, complete eradication of people in terms of death, then large parts you may say that other than what Uyghurs are facing in some areas, it's not full-fledged genocide, right? Now, but as others have pointed out, it is cultural genocide because, of course, what China is doing is under Xi Jinping, it has increased in pace, but it has been going on, as others have pointed out, from very beginning. And I'll end by saying why it was from the very beginning. But under Xi Jinping, the speed has increased and the intention is very clear. So at least in 1980s and 90s, there was some division within the Communist Party of how to manage minorities, what they call minority nationality, right? Some felt that we should have complete control. Others felt maybe give them some autonomy, they might do better. The third had some other arguments, right? So there were divisions. But under Xi Jinping, there's a clear consensus from the top that people cannot have any identity that's distinct from what's seen as Chinese, right? So in that process, what is happening is challenging of culture, change of religion, change of everyday life, and therefore eradication of people as people. So while individuals will survive, and Tibetans as individuals may survive, and they might practice some aspects of culture, what makes them distinctly Tibetan will be eradicated. So in that sense, it's very much a cultural genocide for all the people we are talking about. In some cases, like Uyghurs, culture, it's more than cultural genocide also, right? So just bear in mind, we are talking therefore eradicating people. Now, why is China doing it, especially under Xi Jinping? It is nationalism. So when we look at it, China is not unique in the world. China is doing what many countries have done in the past by making clear that it's very much one idea of nation, one party, one people kind of thing, right? So it's nationalism, but it's also communism. And I bring communism in here because under communism, there's this notion that, of course, remember, this is the ultimate stage of development, communism. Therefore, everyone needs to be assimilated to be the same. Now, some of my colleagues have used the word sinicization, and even I use sinicization in my work. I say occupied people are being sinicized. I'm using occupied deliberately, right? Occupied being a sinicized. But the point is, it's not sinicization in the sense that there is a Han Chinese identity. Everyone has to be like them. Even Han Chinese identity is being domesticated by Communist Party. So we have to bear in mind that even Han Chinese identity is very diverse in different parts of China. What Communist Party, especially under Xi Jinping, is doing, and what Mao had done at one point in time, is making clear there's one way of being Chinese, that's one way of being Han. So Hans who don't agree are also being suppressed. But of course, When it comes to what so-called ethnic minorities or occupied people, it's much worse. So ultimately, violence is at the heart of it. Now, some may think that what about Uyghurs or Mongolians or Tibetans who are okay with, maybe they don't practice their own culture differently. They're not, they are surviving. But the reality is, if they ever raise any political demand, they'll be eradicated immediately. So that is the system. So therefore, rather than talk of only cultural genocide, we have to see the entire system in China as genocidal, and as the first speaker talked of, genocidal machinery or something, the term you use. It is a genocidal machine system. Therefore, rather than looking at what is happening to which people now, we have to recognize that the problem is systemic and comes from the very top.
Thank you, Professor Dibesh Anand, for highlighting the fact that it is not just the ethnic communities having a different culture rather than the Han Chinese that are being impacted, but also the Chinese communities themselves. So thank you so much, Professor Dibesh Anand, and also for speaking about the strategies of the Chinese Communist Party into eliminating the ethnic minorities to form a single Chinese national identity. Thank you. And moving on to our next question. Uh, now we have all our speakers have spoken about. All our speakers have spoken comprehensively about how uh, how this all is being amounted to cultural genocide. Now, can you talk about how can the targeted communities defend their identity and heritage, and what can they do both individually and also collectively to ensure that the world fully understands the true nature and the full extent of China's genocidal policies? Or what can the governments do? What can the governments and the multilateral institutions do to go beyond the statements of concern and take actions, and what yeah, so what are the actions that can be taken by the international communities against these repressive policies of the Chinese Communist Party? Mr. Togochok, over to you.
Sure. I think a two-pronged effort can be made to keep our language, culture, identity alive in our respective communities and eventually regain or reclaim our national freedom. So the first is the engagement of the international community to raise the awareness of what's happening in our communities and also elsewhere in China. So um, in doing so, we must remember that we are living in a world where recognize the genocide is a tiny fraction of committed genocide. So far, only the Uyghur genocide is officially recognized as genocide by the West. In some sense, this means China has the green light or free pass to commit other forms of genocide, such as cultural and religious genocide in southern Mongolia and Tibet. This means we have a very arduous task on our shoulder and a long way ahead of us to convince the international community, convince the West that what China is doing in southern Mongolia, the goal is again the same: to wipe out the entire people, as a distinct people. So that is the goal. So in this sense, the raising awareness, certainly we have certain challenges when we are raising awareness in the international community, but that's what we have to do to overcome this challenge, and then let the world know that there are China is committing some other um, form of genocide in Tibet and southern Mongolia as well. The second type of effort that we have to make is to help empower our people on the ground to remain hopeful and remain defined, through sport, to grassroots level of activism. Despite China's uh, ever tightening internet surveillance and censorship in social media, there are still some ways for us to influence our communities, educate them about how to defend their rights, and because they are our base. They are the people who are the holding the fort. So once they are empowered, once they are aware of their rights, once they are determined to stand up for their rights, however powerful the Chinese regime may be, it cannot stop them from fighting for their standing up to fight for their right. So just like Desmond Tutu said, once a people or nation make up their right to free themselves, nothing on earth can stop them. So still something that we really need to do, and then it's one of the most important tasks uh, to keep our language, culture, identity alive, and then eventually regain and reclaim our national sovereignty, national freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ngepatu Togochok. And I truly agree with you on educating our people regarding our consequences and the causes. And yeah, and to remain hopeful. And yeah, we should, Mr. Ngepatu, we shall talk more on that later in our um, later questions regarding the importance of youth into knowing their own causes. Okay, Zumrite, let's hear your perspective on this.
Thank you, Sakina. I think, first and foremost, I think for our community, our own communities, is to understand what's at stake, what are the long-term consequences of what's happening, and how we can collectively understand this and act upon it. And I think for our community, we collectively understood this in 2016, 2017, when the camps started, and all of our loved ones and relatives started disappearing into these camps, and all communication with our relatives have been slowly started to be cut off. And until this day, we don't most of us in the diaspora community, we don't have contact with our relatives for the since 2016, 17. So it's to come to that collective understanding and how we can mobilize our community. And I think it takes a few people, few organizations to lead that, and for also the community to understand how to preserve certain aspects of our identity. So I think the Uyghur community has done an incredible job at preserving and trying to really protect our own heritage, just because this was put in danger, at risk, in our own country, in our own homeland, where our relatives could no longer do that, or because the circumstances didn't allow them to, because of the policies implemented by the government. So, for example, a lot of in every single country where there's a sizable, important Uyghur community, there's been efforts to preserve, for example, language through the children. So educating the children who were born in the diaspora, to educate them on the language, to preserve that, but also traditions and so on. And in terms, all these things can be done, and also, of course, political mobilization, and a grassroots, at the grassroots level, but also higher level, for example, high level advocacy, international advocacy, that of course the World Congress does as well. But I guess, like, on your question on what can governments do, I mean, I think I can cite a few examples of what governments have done in the past few years to address the specific Uyghur issue, Uyghur genocide. Is first of all, I think recognition of genocide is important, but it's not the only thing that is that can be done. A lot of concrete actions can be taken. For example, refugee protection. We have governments like Canadian governments and other governments who have adopted legislations or regulations, moratoriums to protect Uyghur refugees from refoulement. The Canadian government is currently working on the implementation of M62, which is a motion that passed unanimously in Canadian Parliament in February to resettle 10,000 Uyghur refugees who are at risk in different countries. So these are very specific, tangible actions that are being taken in different countries around the world. Sanctioning individuals or entities that are responsible for enabling this genocidal policies. So, for example, in 2 years ago, the U.S. government, Canadian government, and the EU and the UK have in collaboration sanctioned 4 Chinese officials and one entity, the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, which is responsible for most of the forced labor schemes in the region. They've been sanctioned for their complicity on over the Uyghur genocide. So this is again another way of targeting complicits and those who are responsible, and a way of holding those people accountable. Another one is pushing for independent investigations. Of course, this has been pushed for many years by Uyghur and other groups. And then addressing issues like transnational repression. And I think one of the issues we have been working on recently is also stopping products that are coming from Uyghur forced labor. So, legislation that addresses these issues.
Thank you, Zumrite, and thank you for bringing up the topic on transnational regression. That is something that we will be talking in our next discussion of Asia Freedom Institute. Okay, Tenzin Shigila, let's hear your perspective.
Thank you, Sakina. I think when we think about how the targeted communities can, how and what they can do to let the world know about the ongoing genocide, I see it at 3 levels. So first of all, it's the targeted communities who are directly living under the oppression, and the oppressed know best what's possible, what's conceivable, how, when, and where. So I think for those living outside in exile and diaspora, it is really to continually pay attention to what is being done by those targeted communities, and then to relay and amplify those movements and then messages to the governments. But before one defends one language and culture, I think one has to have a love for one's own land and people. And even after all these decades of colonization, it is very clear that their distinct identity is not going away. And if anything, on the 1st of October, even after the pandemic happened, all these oppressed peoples have come together to protest in front of the Chinese consulates across the world. And this identity and love for one's land and people is very much reinforced by the assimilationist strategies. So that is definitely not going away, and the response from these targeted community is not always going to be uniform. I think the governments they need to know that these peoples are oppressed in different form, and they should not box their framework of understanding these diverse people as having exactly the same tactics of oppression, because then how is it any different from seeing a very singular perspective of having it's in some way having a very uniform and singular monochrome framework of understanding diverse people. So in Tibet, the targeted communities have themselves initiated movements after the widespread 2008 protests and the self-immolations that ensued. For example, Hakar movement, White Wednesday, which is a day that is auspicious for His Holiness this non-violent, decentralized movement has spread across the Tibetan plateau, and even the exile and diaspora Tibetan communities observe it. And just like El Hakar, there's also nowadays Gorshe, a circle dance, which is like a socio-cultural binding force that is happening both in and outside Tibet. Um, so, but now when it comes to Tibetans living outside, who have much greater freedom than those inside, I think whilst we do mirror and amplify voices of Tibetans inside, I think it would really um, help us even more if we are conscious of our own state as being dispersed to communities in exile and diaspora, that we are in a double state of mind, and sometimes exile is deeply challenging condition to live in, and to inherit that exile from one generation to the next. So to be conscious of that existence of our, twin challenge would really help us have two-pronged approach, like Togochok has, said earlier. So that is at the Tibetan diaspora level, and then finally at the government and institutional level. Um, I think one thing that they can definitely do is when the Tibetans ask for asylum in their respective countries, the governments really do understand that the first generation of Tibetans who have fled the Chinese invasion, they have stayed in India and Nepal, and that because of the unresolved issue, their children and their children's children have inherited that exile and challenge. So although they themselves have not really fled, and dodged bullets, but then it's a condition that they inherit a protracted refugee status with no official recognition by both the countries, but then they still live in statelessness, and the precarity of which cannot be overlooked if we want to empower those who are in relative freedom. So when these Tibetans go abroad, sometimes risking lives to ask for asylum, and when the governments give them refugee status, I think they should give them a status as Tibetan refugees or not Chinese refugees. And when they do look for jobs, they should have a drop down section for what the language speaking as Tibetan, not Chinese. These are very concrete things that the governments can do. And then lastly, the governments should take coordinated actions with like-minded countries to do actions like not sending diplomats like they did in Beijing 2022 on Olympics, and then recognize Tibetan government in exile as the legitimate authority, representative of the Tibetan people. So these are just a few things that I can think of right now.
Thank you so much, Shukila, for raising a really important point for the international communities actually recognizing the individual identities, be it the Tibetans or the Uyghurs, the Southern Mongolians, and so on. Okay, let's hear Professor Divyesh Anand's perspective on this.
Thank you again. In terms of, again, I'll not repeat. So, what we think, we talk cultural genocide. Means there's an attack on culture, there's an attack on the people as a people. So, the number one strategy of resistance is to be a people. So, be Tibetan or Uyghur or Mongolian. In exile, we are talking of not inside now, because in inside there's very little agency. So, right. So, one is to survive as a people. That's number one. And we cannot be harsh with people who are exiled, who are surviving, who are occupied in the homeland and in exile, and say, this is how you should behave. So often in the West, in the international community, there's an expectation that, I'm giving example of Tibetans because that's what I've studied for more than 22 years now, is Tibetans ought to be like XYZ. And if they don't behave in XYZ manner, then they're not seen as good refugees who need to be supported. And that is always, I'm sure Uyghurs face the same challenge, Mongolians have faced the same challenge. The number one thing is for communities to survive, to make sure that culture is alive, thriving in exile, while we're waiting for some change in China later. Third, of course, advocacy, which you all do, right? But advocacy, raising awareness, keep talking the language of genocide in this case, talking that we are not Chinese. Right? We might be occupied by China, but we are not Chinese. So even as Chokila said, that in terms of where Tibetans who are claiming asylum, and I know because sometimes I get asked as an expert, is it feels so sad that they have to be seen as Chinese rather than Tibetan, or Indian rather than Tibetan. Not only that, I'll give you an example which is not directly, but you can see why it's connected. There's an International Association of Tibetan Studies. That's the largest scholarly body of Tibet studies. It's huge. It has been flourishing. You may think they will have sympathy for Tibetans. I'm sure many of them have it. But when if you register for it, I've been for last eight conference the last 22 years. The queue would say China, India, the rest of the world. Tibetans don't even exist in Tibetan studies. And when I raised that question, of course, they saw me as a troublemaker, or they saw me, oh, that's because if we have Tibet, then Chinese government will have a problem. And this is what we are talking in the West. So we do need to push back against, and I'm sure, especially those of you who are exiled, you won't have privileges like mine, which is of being in a state, right? And have a comfortable, in that sense, a state identity. But we have to work with you to make sure we push back against erasure of your distinct identity, even in states where it's supposedly friendly, US, UK, France kind I'm talking about, right? So survival is important. In terms of government, we have to keep arguing there, arguing for whatever works for them. And sometimes you'd find that among the left section, and I also identify as progressive left, by the way, but a large number of leftists will have very skepticism towards all this issue because they have some fascination for China, etc. In fact, I'm writing a paper on left fascination / hypocrisy on it. But with them also, rather than assuming that progressives and leftists are not going to be to support, we have to reach out to them and say, look, you talk of human rights, you talk of right to self-determination, you talk of decolonization. How can you talk of decolonization in the West or in Africa, but not recognize that China is a distinctly colonial state? So, in that sense, be creative in making sure that voices get heard and we do not let someone else decide the agenda.
Thank you so much, Professor Divyesh Anand. Now we will move on to the first round of individual questions. And I believe that some of our speakers have a really busy schedule. So I would like to ask all of our speakers to please limit your answers to a very short time. And I think from 5 minutes, I think we should move on to like 2.5 or 3 minutes. Yeah. Okay, so we will start off with Mr. Engebatu Togochok. So, Mr. Togochok, cultural genocide in Southern Mongolia started ever since from 1949, when Southern Mongolia was officially annexed to China. And due to an increase in Chinese population, the demographic situation in Southern Mongolia completely changed. So can you share with us a brief history about the cultural genocide that had happened in Southern Mongolia? And can you also tell us about how China is using maps and terminologies to legitimize their territorial claim over Southern Mongolia? Over to you, Mr. Togochok.
Thank you. Sure. Yes, as you rightly said, the Chinese genocide, Chinese cultural genocide in Southern Mongolia started as early as 1949, when the People's Republic of China officially annexed Southern Mongolia and called Southern Mongolia as the autonomous region. And so at the beginning, of course, Chinese government, the CCP, promised to the Southern Mongolians that the Southern Mongolian would enjoy national autonomy, high degree of autonomy. But that turned out to be a broken promise, and as early as in 1950s, Chinese government started carrying out large scale of ethnic cleansing or genocide. And for example, in 1950s, there was a large scale movement called anti-national rightist movement, accusing almost all Mongolian intellectuals as national rightist, national separatist, and purged them. And the physical genocide started in Southern Mongolia in one particular campaign called purge of the members of the Southern Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, um, is amounts to a full scale physical genocide, physically wiping out the Mongolian people. Um, in this campaign, within 2 years, at least 100,000 Mongolians were tortured to death, and yeah, 500,000 persecuted. At that time, the total population of Southern Mongolia, Mongolian people in Southern Mongolia, was about 1.5 million. So one third of the population is persecuted. So it was a really it's a textbook example of genocide. But of course, at that time, the Chinese issue, China was completely the world, and then this genocide is still unknown to the world and never been recognized as genocide. So in the 1980s, Chinese government continued their population transfer, and a large number of Chinese peasants, Chinese immigrants came to southern Mongolian grassland, and there was one large scale protest that took place in 1981 against this policy, and all Mongolian students took to the streets, and the protest continued for almost 3 months. And so in when it comes to 2000, early 2000, the Chinese government escalated their cultural genocide policy, and adopted two sets of new policies, called ecological migration and livestock grazing ban. And under this policy, all entire Mongolian, rural Mongolian pastoralist community are targeted, and then they were forced to leave their land to come to overwhelmingly Chinese populated, like urban area and agricultural areas. So the Mongolian traditional nomadic way of life is considered as backward and then archaic, and blamed for the ecological environmental degradation, which in fact was caused by the Chinese large scale the agriculture practice and mining practice. So, but Chinese government never, never admit to what they were doing, and then they blame the Mongolian traditional way of life instead. So, this policy is in fact it's a two-way of population Mongolians out of their land and then Chinese in. What happened if the Chinese, the so-called developers or miners in the name of developing the Mongolian, backward areas. They came to cultivate our land, they open up mines and destroy our natural environment. So that's what happened since 2000. And then now is Chinese, the last ditch of effort to completely wipe out the Mongolian uh, identity, the last defense of Mongolian national identity, which is language. And 2000, September 2020, Chinese government came up with the so-called second generation bilingual education policy. And under this policy, government of China announced to completely remove Mongolian language from all educational institutions, elementary school, from kindergarten to colleges. So at the beginning, government of China was saying that we only replace Mongolian with Chinese as uh, medium of instruction, language of instruction, within only three subject. But now, recently, Chinese government announced that actually, you know what, we want to do, this for all schools, from kindergarten to colleges, for all Mongolian schools. That means Mongolian language will completely disappear from the educational system, and then Mongolian language itself will be taught as a foreign language once a week in school. But that is still under debate. and possibly will never gonna happen, and no Mongolian language will be taught at all. So this is what's happening in South Mongolia. So this is again, it's a very systematic, very well planned campaign of entire Mongolian nation in Southern Mongolia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Togochuk, for sharing with us a comprehensive insight about how the policies of the Chinese Communist Party are impacting the lives of the Southern Mongolian people in Southern Mongolia. Thank you so much, Mr. Togochuk. And moving on to Zumrite. In May 2014, Xi Jinping called for the construction of walls made of copper and steel to defend East Turkestan against terrorism. And this marked the beginning of a hardline policy towards the Uyghur people and the construction of mass internment camps. And China, using the pretext of countering terrorism, began targeting all expressions of Islamic faith. So today, the Uyghur community has become a well known case study of China's genocidal, cultural genocide, right? So, Zumriti, can you tell us what is happening in East Turkestan today and to the Uyghur heritage and to the Uyghur identity? Over to you, Zumriti.
Thank you. Yeah, as you pointed out, Xi Jinping arrived to power. He implemented a series of legislations. So starting 2014, they were repressive policies, legislation that were adopted in the name of national security and counterterrorism. So one of these laws is the counterterrorism law and also the regulation on de-extremification. So since then, the Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism started, and it really targeted religious practices of the Uyghur people by associating basically religious practice with extremism and separatism. So with under these laws, everyday behaviors such as wearing a hijab, going to the mosque, praying, owning a Quran, all of these normal religious activities and behaviors have become criminalized under these laws. And since then, and of course, these laws have been widely condemned by the international community, including by UN experts, and of course, last year by also the Office of the High Commissioner in their independent assessment on the situation in the region as well. And of course, with this kind of laid groundwork for the repressive environment that was to come. So also with Qin Chuangguo, who was also the party secretary to the region, who was also appointed to Tibet right before his appointment to East Turkestan, he brought all of these surveillance technologies and surveillance methods into East Turkestan, and he basically transformed the region in an Orwellian state where there was surveillance everywhere, DNA. They were using also all sorts of methods to collect data from the population through DNA collection, blood samples, iris scans, to really gather as much information as possible on the citizens and use it against them. So since then, of course, we know about the mass internment of over 1 million, up to 3 millions of Uyghurs and Turkic people in so-called re-education centers that are basically concentration camps, because the conditions in which the detainees are held in, but also how they end up there in a completely arbitrary manner, is very telling, and it really resembles, the concentration camp sort of atmosphere and environment as well. And of course, in these centers or camps, detention centers, there's the widespread use of torture against detainees, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, rape, gang rape, maltreatment, humiliation, which was corroborated by witnesses and also the victims themselves who have survived these camps. We have some camp survivors in the diaspora who managed to escape. and have been testifying to these facts as well. And of course, with that also coincided, I think also it's important to note that the first group of targeted individuals were the Uyghur intellectual and elite, so intellectual scholars, professors, every Uyghur uh, individual who had an influence in the society was the first target of the government. So they started by interning them, disappearing them. Until this day, we know of thousands of cases of intellectuals and scholars who have, disappeared and interned in these camps. And the reason for that is just kind of targeting these people, this elite. They know that there is they're responsible for the innovation, for the flow of information, for promoting different freedoms. So by targeting them, you're also eliminating a group of people that are responsible for the passing down of knowledge to the next generation. And of course, there's widespread use of Uyghur forced labor in the region that's been documented in the recent years in across industries, in the textile, solar, automotive industry, agriculture, technology industry, and beyond. But I think the most telling components of this genocide is the widespread use of violence against women, um, by forcibly sterilizing Uyghur women, by forcibly marrying Uyghur women off to Chinese men, and incentivizing these interethnic marriages. But also by targeting and separating families, especially young children who have been sent to state-run orphanages, separated from their parents, where they're sinicized basically, and creating this kind of by separating families inside but also outside. For example, us in the diaspora, we're also separated from our families, so really trying to isolate the Uyghur people from the rest, and assimilate them, and of course eliminate them as well. So this is kind of the broad spectrum, and the broad range of issues that the Uyghur community is faced with today.
Thank you so much, Zumrate, for sharing with us about the plight of the Uyghur people, and especially the women. And we shall delve more into that in our next question. And Chugila, so Tibet Watch published a report on January 2023 on the destruction of the Tibetan religious heritage, arbitrary detentions, torture, and re-establishment of the re-education centers in Chaco County in eastern Tibet, right? So could you provide us with more information on what is happening in Chaco County? And can you also share with us the findings of your report and the key recommendations that can be used to address this problem? Over to you, Chugila.
Thank you, Sakinala. I'm conscious of time, so I will leave out the recommendations. If anyone is interested in the report, it's on our website, tibetwatch.org. I'll just dive into the key findings. Sorry, there's a big truck outside. So Chango County, the desecration in Chango County happened it started initially around late October 2021. What happened was, in total, desecration of a Buddhist monastic school, a 99-foot Buddha statue that was built to prevent natural catastrophes. Chango County had witnessed a devastating earthquake midway through Cultural Revolution in 1973. So that big Buddha statue was destroyed, and also a 3-story high statue of Buddha of the future, and then another statue of Guru Rinpoche, the great tantric master from India, and also 45 giant prayer wheels that pilgrims and devotees spin daily as part of their cultural and religious life in Chango County. And the Chango monasteries, Labrang, which is like the residence of the local Rinpoche, that was also torn down, and prayer flags were burned down. And quite, obviously, the locals have therefore described whatever happened as a second cultural revolution. The Chinese authorities gave many reasons, plenty as it always been, saying that there's a need for fire access, that that it was illegal, that it was built on an illegal land, but the manner in which these desecration followed was through coercion of respected religious leaders in the community who were called into the police station and then told to convince the local people to tear down their own Buddhist school. So, in our research, we have also found that this county, Tango, which is known for a very strong sense of Tibetan identity and courageous resistance against the Chinese government since 2008 and 2012, has seen expansion. Well, not expansion. We have tracked the changes in the security facilities in Chango County. So at least 10 detainees were at least 10 detainees were taken to the so-called, what the sources have described as re-education center and subjected to torture. And there's been a new prison constructed in the suburbs. So overall, we have seen a systematic desecration of sites of cultural and religious significance to the Tibetan people in Chango County. I'll stop it there, I think.
Yeah, and I would like to ask Professor Divyesh Anand, if you don't mind, because we have a last question from Mr. Togochok and he has to leave. So can we just ask him so that he can leave,
Yeah,
and then
sure.
we can follow up with, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Divyesh Anand. And so Mr. Tokochuk, you are the director of Southern Mongolian Human, sorry,
Human Rights Information Center.
yeah, thank you. Southern
Yeah,
Mongolian
it's
Human
very
Rights
long.
Information Center.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very long abbreviation.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does your organization mobilize support for your cause and people? And given that in Southern Mongolia, the access is really difficult, so how are you able to monitor, collect information, and stay in touch with your people? And can you also tell us the role and responsibility of the Southern Mongolians living in exile and also in diaspora? Mr. Togucho, you know that we had your daughter for our previous session on the title Empowering Youth for Democracy, Peace and Justice. She was one of our speakers, and we could see that she was so motivated and she was so informed about her cause. So how are you keeping the younger generation in your community informed and motivated? Over to you, Mr. Togochok.
Thank you. My organization, Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center, is established in 2001, and over the past 22 years, our main focus is to raise awareness, engaging news media, human rights organization, national and international human rights bodies such as like United Nations, U.S. Congress, U.S. State Department, European Parliament, and so on. So over the past 2 decades, we have built a relatively large information network in the U.S., Europe, Japan, Mongolia, and most importantly, among the people on the ground in southern Mongolia. Through these networks, we obtain and distribute information, document, and make report on the major human rights um, violation cases, resistance, and so on. So in the same time, we are trying very hard to train younger generations to take up the responsibilities to fight for the freedom of our nation. As part of our effort, we encourage young people within our community to actively get involved in protests, meetings, conferences, and other activities. Of course, there are certain challenges. For example, young people are in general lack of the intimate knowledge and the experience of what has happened and what's happening in their home countries. There are a lot of patience, a lot of training is needed for young people to bring them up to speed. And another challenge is due to the Chinese authorities' long oppression and brutal repression. Fear is instilled into the general population among our community. That I'm sure that is true in not just in Southern Mongolia but also Tibet, East Turkestan, and even in China proper. So people are in general afraid of engaging in human rights and political activism because their families or their relatives are taken hostages back in their um, respective communities, and they were persecuted. So despite all these challenges, I'm still very optimistic. People are still hopeful. In Southern Mongolia, for example, in 2020, almost entire Southern Mongolians took part in mass protest. In an unprecedented level of energy and passion to say no to the Chinese authorities. Almost 300,000 students took to the street, and from kindergartners to college students, from elementary school teachers to college professors, from ordinary herders to government officials, and even party members and police officials took part of the protest. And so all Mongolians from all walks of life in Southern Mongolia took part. This took part in this mass protest. This tells us that people are actually ready when it times comes. My people are ready to stand up, and they're ready to strike. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Engibatu Togojo, for sharing with us your insights. And thank you so much for giving us your time. I know you have to leave now. And yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Togojo. And thank you, Chugila, for keeping it really short. And I'm so sorry that I forgot to acknowledge and talk to you about that. But then, yeah, if you want to know, to our audience, if you want to know the recommendations in the report of, then you can go on to Tibet Watch website, and you can read the full report there. So now I have two questions for Professor Dibyesh Anand, and I would like to combine the two questions because Professor Dibyesh Anand is also, he has to leave soon. So Professor Dibesh Anand. Like I have seen a lot of like some of your interviews on YouTube, and in one of your talks, you've characterized the development brought by China as a mechanism of control rather than an ideal development, right? So, what is your perspective on the Chinese government policies towards the ethnic and non-Chinese communities under its occupation through the so-called whatever we spoke about, like the vocational education and the training centers, the colonial boarding schools, and so on? And also, can you tell us how has the international relations and interactions influenced China's approach towards Southern Mongolians, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and other non-Chinese communities currently occupied by China? What are your thoughts on the need for scholars and activists to take a more comparative perspective so that these individual cases of these ethnic groups facing CCP's persecution is viewed and presented as a part of central policy by the Chinese state and the CCP to completely eradicate all non-Chinese culture and assimilate everyone as Chinese? Over to you, Professor Divyesh Anand.
Okay, thank you. And I'll start with the apology because I have to leave, otherwise I would have liked to stay.
It's all right.
No, what I argue essentially is that the only way to understand China's relation with Uyghurs, Mongolians, and Tibetans, and even Hong Kong people is via the lens of colonialism. So China is a colonial state. It's not a neo-colonial state. It's not a post-colonial state. It's not semi-colonial state. It's a full-fledged colonial state. The way, for instance, Britain was in India or in Kenya, and France was in Algeria, etc., right? And again, in my own work, I've expanded why it's colonial. So in my own scholarship, I've written detailed articles on that, specifically focused on Tibetans and Uyghurs. Now, one aspect of colonialism always is that we are there for your welfare, whether you want it or not. That's the story, right? Colonialism is never about simply exploitation, violence, brutalization, dehumanization. It's always that. It's more than that. It's doing all of it, but presenting the the one doing violence as the nice person. Look, I'm doing it for your welfare, right? So I am taking all the effort to develop you. So if you look at the language of China vis-a-vis the occupied people, it's a language of benign paternalism, that Uyghurs are singing, dancing, happy people. They don't know what to do. We will train them how to work better. Tibetans are again, too religious, too, they don't know how to be modern. We will modernize them. So if you look at that process, they use violence, they use cultural change, they use domestication, they use assimilation, they use sometimes selective focus on culture if it suits them for touristic purpose, etc. But development is a crucial part, because by saying we are bringing development to these people, they're justifying the rule not to these people, because actually they don't care what Uyghurs and Tibetans think, or Mongolians. They know they can control them. It is to assuage the morality of Han Chinese majority, that look, we are bringing development to those minorities, and still those minorities are demanding more. Means they are thankless, right? How do you deal with thankless brats? You teach them lessons. That's what they did. And also the language of development is for the international community to say that, look, we are developing Tibetans and Uyghurs who are backward. Now, the reason I say it's a mechanism of control rather than anything else is because British brought railways to India. It's an old story of always justifying why British rule in India was good. Famines were there, that's fine, but they brought railways, development. So it has always taken place. So we have to bear that in mind. And when we acknowledge and recognize China as a colonial state, we do know that we need to decolonize. There's an international right to decolonize. That's why I use the colonial framework. Now, the role of international community has been both. It has helped sometimes exile communities to survive, but also restricted them. So at this point in time, in US and Europe, there's a focus on Uyghurs. In 1990, there was a focus on Tibetans. Now, the situation of Tibetans didn't improve, that the focus on Tibetans largely disappeared. And situation of Uyghur is not suddenly so bad that it gets there. There is geopolitical angle there. Now, what I would suggest to all of us, and I'm in solidarity, that while taking all the support we get, we also should not become dependent on it. If we took example of what the West did with Kurdish people, they supported them, Kurds fought for them, and then they abandoned Kurds when they needed to. They're good at doing it. But what China does is, of course, China is playing a long-term game. On the left side in West and other parts, okay, to global South, China will say that we are here as like you, developing country, West is interfering. Then to Muslim countries, it will say, yes, Uyghurs are Muslim, but look, they are developing. But look, I haven't spoken to any Muslim country leaders, but I don't think anyone believes that what's happening to Uyghurs is right. But they do believe that China is a mighty country, and therefore they do not upset it. That's what's going on. But China is also doing public diplomacy in all parts of the world to show themselves as the victim of Western imperialism still. So the idea is somehow Tibetans and Uyghurs are stooges in the hands of evil West against China. And role of scholars like myself is to push back against it, and push back against, because I cannot make much difference to Chinese government way of thinking. That's a reality. Yeah, I don't think you can do it that much, right? But what we can necessarily do is recognize that the debate is also taking place in our own countries wherever we are, and we make sure that the propaganda slash narrative peddled by China, that it's somehow a post-colonial anti-Western country, is, sorry, what's the word, bull sh dot word, because China is nothing but a modern colonialist power that commits genocide when it suits interest, commits cultural genocide a lot of time, and even when it doesn't commit, it reserves the power and the capacity and the will to commit genocide whenever it suits interest. So overall, I would say is we need to keep working hard. And final thing I would say is we have our differences. We'll always have differences within communities, between communities. That's fine. When China can work with itself and be so good at reaching out to different countries for its interests, we have to be better at working with each other and not focus on differences, but focus on what unites us. And what unites us is the desire for people to survive and desire for people to then flourish, and ultimately to have a genuinely decolonized world. And for that to start by decolonizing China and freeing people. So freedom is important.
Thank you so much, Professor Divyesh Anand, for your valuable insights and for giving us really interesting examples. And we really, really hope to have you in our next discussion, in like our upcoming discussions as well, Professor Divyesh Anand. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Thank you. Okay, moving on to Zumrite, and I request our speakers. I know there are only two of you, but then we have already exceeded our time limit, so I request our speakers to please keep your answers really short and up to the point. So, Zumrite, we are all aware of the fact that Uyghur women go through multiple suppressions under the CCP's policies, like you said, from being forcefully sterilized to being forcefully married to Han Chinese as a means of cultural assimilation, right? So, as the chair of the Women's Committee of the World Uyghur Congress, can you shed light on the specific experiences and challenges faced by the Uyghur women? And can you also tell us the steps taken by the World Women's Committee of World Uyghur Congress to directly counter these repressive policies against the Uyghur women? Over to you, Zumrite.
Sure, I'll try to keep this very short. As I said, I think Uyghur women are also experiencing collective trauma, as we are all in our community. But we are, the women specifically are carrying a lot of this burden, because if you look at it, the women are used in China's genocide. Women are usually used, as a weapon of war in all atrocity crimes in war situations everywhere around the world. And in this specific context, forced sterilization, rape, and all these kind of gender-based abuses and violence that they go through is very difficult, of course, on the mental level as well. It's for not only the women in the diaspora community, but also the women back in our homeland. So something that I have tried to do as chair of the women's committee is to bring women together, from different age groups, to discuss about these issues in an open and honest, and also in a safe space to discuss these issues. And because, of course, in our communities, and I think it's also similar in the Tibetan community, is that there are a lot of taboo topics, and especially when we talk about gender violence, gender-based violence, sexual violence, these are not easy topics to talk about in our community. So I'm trying to aim to create these kind of safe spaces where we can talk about this, and also talk about some of the things that we can do, some of the solution oriented things that we can think of. And there's a specific project that I've been also leading, is documenting the some of the documenting, basically assess some of the risks that these women face in the diaspora community, of course, because we don't have access to our community back home. So to start with our community in the diaspora, specifically the women survivors, the camp survivors, because a lot of them are women, and they've had to deal with a lot of pressure coming from the Chinese, but also from their own community. So how to assess kind of their needs, and what can we do to protect them, to also develop some sort of guidelines when they share their experiences, because they share their stories everywhere internationally, in parliaments, in different places. So how to protect them from re-traumatization when they tell their stories, and how to work with them, how to empower them. So this is kind of some of the steps that we've taken to address some of these challenges.
Thank you so much, Zumride, for sharing with us the challenges faced by the Uyghur people, and for the steps taken by the World Uyghur Congress to help protect the Uyghur people from all sorts of oppression by the Chinese Communist Party. And we have now our last question to Tenzin Shukila. So, Shukila, it is clear, and from the answer that you have told us about the plight of the Chaco County also, I realized that there was so much of religious destruction there. So it is clear that the Chinese government and the CCP are interfering with the Tibetan Buddhism. We also witness all this through the demolition of multiple monasteries and religious institutions in Tibet. And the best example is the Larungar and the Yachingar monasteries, where structures were destroyed and monks and nuns, they were disrobed, and they were made to leave their monasteries. So this interference is even more evident in the Chinese government's efforts to control the reincarnation process of the Tibetan Buddhist Tibetan religious figures, particularly the institutions of the Dalai Lama. So, Chugila, can you tell us how does control of Tibetan Buddhism advance in the Chinese government and the CCP's objective of assimilation and sinicization of Tibetan identity and culture? Over to you, Chugila.
Thank you. Religion and religion has always co-evolved with the rise and fall of empires, kingdoms, and the formation of nation states. So, given the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is now above everything else, above everyone else, and Tibetan Buddhism is an essential part of the Tibetan life, they have been co-opting it, and nowadays they're trying to sinicize it to introduce a vision and a worldview that is theirs and not that is reflective of the Tibetan history. Um, so and they how they advance it is not in isolation, just in monasteries. It is through the dominance of the study, use, and development of Chinese language. So as you were explaining earlier about the desecration of the monasteries throughout, from the invasion to cultural revolution to nowadays, there's been a dramatic reduction of the monastic population, and there is control over the age limit of who enrolls in the monastic in institutions, and also there are tulku training centers in Tibet where the young reincarnate, tulkus are given and so-called education that the CC deems appropriate, very much within their own control. So and the so and the how they advance in another way is they have always His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he is the 14th Dalai Lama, and the 5th and the 14th Dalai Lama has really united Tibet like no other Dalai Lamas. So they know that religion and the religious diversity that has flourished under these two Dalai Lamas play a very fundamental part of Tibetan identity. So they want to control everything that is enmeshed with the history of the Dalai Lama institution. And nowadays, in the monastic institution, they make the monks and nuns take up exams on laws, and they are also distributed, legal materials in Tibetan and Chinese language. So even if they are making the use of Tibetan language and making the use of Tibetan skilled translators, it is always at the use of propagating their ideas and beliefs. So and in the monastic institutions, the monks and nuns, they are also forced to denounce their spiritual leaders, not just the Dalai Lama, and sign letters saying that they denounce them, and also shout against their spiritual leaders in prisons. So that's the level of control. It's a psychological torture, if uh, that is that has even made some Tibetans kill themselves, because it's unbearable for them to denounce their leaders and to look upon compassionate people who have only guided them during their times of sorrow. And sadly, sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism is continuing. As early as 1992, Tungar Lobsang Chinle, the great scholar who is usually known for his encyclopedia, have warned this assimilation. Although he himself was a Rinpoche, he really called for the need for use and development of Tibetan in all all fields of study, not just Buddhist studies. And when he was passing away in his last days at the hospital, he expressed deep sadness that the shift in Chinese policy at the time was signaling towards a systematic assimilation, and we have now seen this pass. So I think that's how the change of how they've used language to suppress religion, control it, and even change it to suit their vision and worldview.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chukila. And thank you, everyone, for your time, your candidness, and your invaluable contributions. Our conversation today has moved us one step further on the path towards understanding justice and human rights. Each of your perspectives has greatly contributed to our understanding of what is a complex and deeply concerning situation. Let's carry forward the insights and recommendations shared today into our ongoing efforts. Thank you so much, everyone, once again for giving us your valuable time. And before I end, let me quickly tell you that the video of the session will be uploaded on Asia Freedom Institute's website, www.asiafreedom.org. And please follow Asia Freedom Institute's Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn pages for more information of Asia Freedom Institute's programs and activities. Thank you so much. Everyone, once again. And I would like to thank everyone who is involved for today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Sakinala.